Welcome who have joined this very interesting webinar titled Beyond Extraction, Rights, Resilience, and Inclusive Transition. I'll be moderating today's session. As Alyssa said, I'm a researcher at University of Cambridge. My research focuses on um, uh, stewarding capital away from fossil fuel and towards more responsible investment and address systemic risks like climate change. I'll be starting my doctoral research on critical minerals and industrial policy in India in October at the same university. But today I've been joined by three very interesting thinkers and practitioners in this field, which I'll introduce in a bit. But before that, I'll just quickly lay out the flow of this webinar. The way I thought of doing this would be we have three panelists who would be presenting their work one by one. We have Caroline and Yblin sharing a presentation and Ludivine doing an oral presentation somewhere between 8 to 12 minutes, which will be followed by a moderated discussion. And then we will open up for the audience question and answer. On this note, let me just quickly jump into our first presenter, Caroline Avan, who is the head of natural resources and just transition team at the very amazing Business and Human Rights Resource Center, BHRRC. She leads the Resource Center's research and analysis on corporate abuses, policies, and practices in renewable energy value chains, from extraction of transition minerals to deployment and to the engagement advocacy towards company and the investors. She'll be presenting some of her recent analysis and work. So we are super looking forward to Caroline's presentation.
Thank you so much, Saurav. So my name is Caroline Avan, and I'm the head of Natural Resources and Just Energy Transition team at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Thank you so much to IRTC for the invitation for this very timely and interesting webinar. What I would like to present to you today is very quickly the recent findings from our transition minerals tracker. So I will explain in a minute what our transition minerals tracker is about, as well as offer some recommendations around human rights, the risk of human rights abuses in the search for transition minerals. But before we get to that, just wanted to say just a quick few words on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So we are an international human rights organization dedicated to advancing human rights in business. We have the largest information hub on business and human rights issue, and we also have been developing our own research and analysis in support of our advocacy goals, which are to push for shared prosperity in global business operations, corporate duty of care, and the role of state in maintaining this corporate duty of care, and around fair negotiations between businesses, workers, and communities. And so in my team, we focus on advancing these strategic goals along renewable energy value chain. So we look at what's going on in transition minerals extraction, and we also look at the implementation and development of renewable energy projects. And you can see here on the slide some of our recent research report. Oops, I think I went too far. So I want to start with explaining what we did with the transition minerals tracker. We know that this is, we are at the time where we've seen governments in the global north rushing to secure mineral supply chain. And it's undisputable that climate change is indeed the greatest threat to human rights and that the energy transition is mining intensive. But we also know, and this is what we're going to discuss now in a minute, that mining activities are also incredibly risky for people and the planet. At the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we think that we don't have and we should not choose between fighting climate change and protecting human rights. We think that a just transition must mean working towards greater global equity, which means that first we need to look at policy options to reduce demand for new mining and how this can be considered. And where new minerals are still needed, which is undoubtedly the case, we need to see where there are possibilities to increase policy attention to the risk on human rights abuses and environmental impact in the extraction of these minerals. And what I'm going to explain to you today is that communities, indigenous peoples and workers' rights are still very much threatened in this extraction of transition minerals. That is the reason why we launched the Transition Minerals Tracker back in 2019. In this tool, which is an online database, essentially, we monitor the risk of human rights abuses across all geographies associated with significant and large-scale mining operations of key minerals in the manufacturing of renewable energy technologies, electrification, and batteries. So we monitor 245 mines, and we cover 8 minerals: bauxite, cobalt, copper, lithium, manganese, nickel, zinc, and we just added iron ore, which is actually a base metal, but incredibly important for the manufacturing of wind turbines in particular, to our list in 2025. So like I said, it's a database of records of publicly reported alleged abuses by a company, civil society action against company, lawsuits, regulatory action, and also publicly reported attacks against human rights defenders in connection with business activities. We started doing that in 2019, but we've collected cases since 2010, so we now have more than 15 years worth of data. And the one thing that I want to really say now is that we only include publicly available information, which means that it's a function of the state of media and civic freedoms, and also really much depends on restrictions in certain parts of the world, coupled with limited means of actions for affected parties and fears of reprisals, which can translate into underreporting of abuses. So the data that we have collected should really be seen as the tip of the iceberg in terms of the human rights risk that are associated with the extraction of these 8 minerals. So just to take you very quickly, but hopefully without getting into too many details across the key findings for the latest edition of our Transition Minerals Tracker, which we launched 2 weeks ago now. We now have collected more than 800 allegations of abuses associated with more than 2,700 impacts across the 6 categories that we use for analysis, which you can see on the slide. So we look at local communities, we look at our environment, impacts on workers, governance and transparency. So we look at cases of allegations of corruption, security issues and conflict zone, and we also have a category related to the COVID-19 pandemic from a few years ago. And I want to start, and I also want to say that, those are not watertight categories. They don't necessarily do a good job at describing the realities lived by communities on the ground. And stakeholders are often the very same individuals and families whose members may work at the mine too. Environment may be also affected by mining operations. And so we have more than 2/3 of all allegations that cut across impact on local communities and impact on the environment. So what we see often are stories of patterns that start with environmental violation, particularly water and soil pollution, compounded by limited or absent consultations with local residents, which then lead to protracted social conflicts. And so one example, one case in point, is the Las Bambas copper mine in Peru, which is ranking first in this year's tracker, but it's been ranking first for the past couple of years. And we also have, of course, 1 in 3 cases, that relate to access to water or water pollution, as well as 1 in 4 cases that relate to labor rights. So lots of stories with interrelated, interconnected harms on different categories of stakeholders and also on the environment. Copper is associated with the highest number of allegations, more than 60%, including many attacks against human rights defenders, possibly reflecting severe issues with the protection of civil freedoms in Latin America in particular. And so Peru is a country associated with the highest number of allegations, including attacks against human rights defenders. Our data also suggests that women are disproportionately affected by mining operations. And of course, last but not least, indigenous peoples in particular are particularly at risk, with 48 allegations of violation of their right to free prayer and informed consent across all years. I want to just say a few words as well about the category of attacks the category that relates to human rights defenders attacks, and that's 1 in 5 cases that we have in our database. We include cases of judicial harassment, including arbitrary detention, but also strategic lawsuits against public participation, intimidation and threats, injuries, killings, denial of freedom of expression and association. So we have 157 cases in our database so far. And this is unfortunately not surprising, as mining has consistently been the most dangerous sector for defenders, according to our work on human rights defenders globally. And such attacks on defenders really are not standalone events. There's a continuum between affected rights and attacks against those defending them. And those attacks in many countries and in many contexts really aim at suppressing their voices and really delegitimizing their ask and weaponizing their demands. In 2024, the highest number of attacks, 5 recorded in our database, was in relation to a manganese mine in Georgia. So I just wanted to say one word about this case, and you can see a picture of workers at the mine on the slide. In this particular case, workers and contractors at the mine joined protests initiated by local residents demanding compensation for damaged and destroyed housing caused by the mine. They prevented workers from entering and operating the mine. In response, they were dismissed by the company, which accused them of disrupting work processes. And the company filed also reports with the police. And these attacks happened in the context of intensified measures to stifle civil society, independent media, and political opposition in Georgia, and this is still very much ongoing. Now, just a few words on the companies and corporate accountability here. 20 companies are associated with 60% of all allegations that we have in the tracker. So it really demonstrates that this is highly concentrated to actually a small number of big companies among the most established in the sector. And so you can see on the slide the list of the top 20 companies that are associated with cases in our online database. We also looked at whether the mines that we track, when we see an allegation, whether this mine is covered by human rights policy, be that it is the human rights policy of the subsidiaries, the operator, or the parent company. And we found that less than 50% of the mines that are associated with at least one case in our database actually has a human rights policy in place. And it doesn't even say if it's a good policy or not. So that's a pretty dismal figure. So there's a big corporate accountability gap, which is really compounded by absent or limited legislation in many countries. And this really could be worsened by recent industry moves to push for voluntary standards. Recently, we've been very concerned with the Consolidated Mining Standard Initiative, which is a new initiative for voluntary standards that has been pushed by mining associations, and really that does not align with international standards and norms of responsible business conduct, human rights law, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and of course, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So, social unrest and conflicts have been increasing in the context of the mining sector. And what we see is that rights holders are increasingly turning to courts to bridge this gap. We've seen an increase in the type of social conflicts and also in the type of litigation that is being used. We now have 40 cases of lawsuits and 7 for 2024 only. We also know that many mines have been confronted with stop orders issued by courts as a result of litigation. This includes the case of the Cobre Panama copper mine in Panama, a nickel mine in Brazil, another nickel mine owned by Sirge Group in Guatemala. So that's something that companies should really take seriously, because not only states are taking, or starting, some states are starting to take some regulatory action, but communities and rights holders and indigenous peoples in particular are starting to litigate some of the abuses that they are facing. So just to finish with this presentation, we have detailed recommendations in our report to states, investors, mining companies, but also to downstream users, user company of transition minerals. But what we really, the message here is really that our database really highlights the risk of a global rush to minerals without strong safeguards. And there's this current narrative at the moment that social and environmental human rights safeguards are slowing down the energy transition. But to the contrary, they are essential. The more they are sidelined, the more they are ignored, and the more we accelerate permitting and licensing processes in the mining sector, the more we'll see social conflicts picking up and the more litigation we may see. We also know that some states and also groups have been calling for a departure from business as usual. Indigenous peoples in particular are making clear demands for respect for their rights in mining for transition minerals. We've also seen some investors starting taking action and demanding better corporate accountability in the sector. And finally, the UNSG-led panel, which was launched last year in September, also offered some new pathways to think what the way forward could look like. So again, a just energy transition can only be based on shared prosperity, fair negotiation, and corporate duty of care. We offer detailed recommendations in our report for different categories of users. I will stop there. Back to you, Saurav. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline. This is such a amazing, enlightening presentation, and I really encourage the participants, whoever have attended so far, have enjoying this, and highly recommend looking at that tool. It's so comprehensive and updated, so I highly encourage people to check and play with that tool for a bit. Um, I already have some questions which I'll kind of save for Caroline towards the end. I think I'll invite Yblin for the next presentation. Yblin, just to quickly share about her. Yblin is a policy advisor at the Sirge Coalition, where she advocates for indigenous people's rights in the context of global energy transition. She holds a PhD in the environmental toxicology from Ghent University in Belgium, and she currently serves as a postdoctoral researcher at the same institution, where she oversees the social life cycle assessment for European projects. And she also is an invited lecturer at Wives University College in Belgium. I had the privilege to meet her a couple of months ago in person, and she'll be talking and sharing about her research and recent work. So super excited, Yblin, to hear and see the very engaging presentation you have to share.
Thank you, Saurav. Good afternoon. Alin Punchai, Ancha Agradesheki. Good afternoon, everyone. So happy to be here. I am, as Saurav said, a policy advisor at the Securing Indigenous People's Rights in the Green Economy Coalition, with a big name that explains everything from the beginning. It's very easy to come after Caroline because she has said it all. I mean, most of the important parts are already said. I'm going to highlight, I'm going to build a bit on the ESGs concept. But before we go into ESGs and talk about ESGs, I would like to know who we have in the audience. What's our starting line? I'm going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second, please. And let me know when you see my screen. Don't mind about those results. Those results come from a test input. So if you would be so kind to go via the QR code or via that number to slido.com, you come to this. Yes, we are getting already the first answers. We're going to give some 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute. Yes. How familiar are you with ESGs? Would you say I've heard about ESGs, but I don't fully know them? I work with ESGs, or I am a professional. I do it every day. Am I new? Okay. Most of our audience so far is familiar, but don't use ESGs daily. Okay. No one is new to ESGs. Wonderful. Just a couple of seconds more. Excellent. I think our public is quite familiar with ESGs. ESGs, as you know, stands for environmental, social, and governance standards, frameworks, issues, and they are used to evaluate, assess companies on how they handle sustainability. Basically, we could say that it's the way to say if a company is harming the environment, if they are treating people fairly, if they are treating workers fairly, if they are engaging with local communities, if they are governed responsibly, if they have a board, what's the board quality, what's the diversity in there, is there accountability to shareholders? Well, I'm going to save the details because you know already the ESGs to a reasonable level. Then let's go to the next one. What comes to your mind when you think of ESGs, environmental, social, and governance risks, in the mining or energy transition projects or sector? Please just put all your thoughts there. What comes to your mind? ESGs, mining, deforestation, yes, a very important one. Accountability, human rights abuses, water pollution, indigenous rights, thank you for that. And all are important topics. Poisoning, water pollution, it's a huge one. It's very much related and linked to mining. And child labor, negotiations, corruption, illegal mining, no consent, community displacements. Yes. Great inputs. Accident risk, health impacts, human rights abuses, forced labor. Yes, these are all relevant topics. I see many, and I see also human rights and linking to indigenous people's rights, but there is one that often gets missed, both in conversations like the one we have today and in ESG scores. And that is, did indigenous peoples give their consent? Consent. That question is foundational. It's basic for indigenous peoples, and we think for everyone. Why? Because 54% of energy transition minerals are on or near indigenous peoples' territories. FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, is a right recognized under international law. It means indigenous peoples' communities have the right to say a full yes, a full no, or yes with conditionalities to a project affecting their lands, their lives, their livelihoods. And that's basic. And this comes, free, prior, and informed consent, before the project starts. You don't come when the project is already running, or when you have already the permit of the government, or when you have the full design finished and all the inversion made. No, it comes from at the beginning, and it comes after a full informed process where indigenous peoples have received culturally appropriate information. I like to highlight here something that is very common. It's a very common mistake. Free, prior, and informed consent is not, the C in the free, prior, and informed consent is not consultation. It's consent. It's full consent. It's the right to say yes, yes with conditionalities, or no. Very good. Then let's go. The water pollution is the winner in our word cloud. Let's go to the next point. Now you have heard about FPIC and just 1 second. Yes. Would you put FPIC within the ESGs? Would you put it in the E for environment? Would you put it in the S for social? Or the G for governance? Or all the above? Social, governance. Okay, social is winning, close, very close with by all the above. Governance is also included. Nothing in environment yet so far. Social is the winner for the moment. Just 10 more seconds. Yeah. Actually, the answer to this to this question is all the above. It's a difficult question, but when we think about the S, you have immediately in mind the social license to operate. And social license to operate is directly linked with free, prior, and informed consent. It's just like it's free, prior, and informed consent. FPIC is one and the same with social license to operate. The social acceptance of indigenous peoples communities come through a sound and healthy free, prior, and informed consent process. But it's also environment, because when you go to environment, you have biodiversity, which is very important for indigenous peoples and for which indigenous peoples is important. You have water, is a huge one. You remember the word cloud just before. You have and for the governance, you have co-ownership, you have stakeholder participation, you have rights holders participation. So actually, we propose here that the I of indigenous peoples should be included in the ESG of environment, social, and governance standards. Thank you so much for the participation. I think it's clear that the ESGs are important, but how important are they for companies was already highlighted by Caroline. She mentioned that there are more and more conflicts. This leads to delays in the project. This leads to reputational costs. This leads to economic costs. When ESG systems don't ask, was consent obtained? Are land rights protected? Was a sacred site destroyed? There is not really a bad ESG score, but there are conflicts on the ground. The company gets points for emission target reduction and board diversity, but not respecting indigenous people's rights is a major governance gap. And there are problems, and we see that on the ground. I would like to talk about an example. We could talk, for example, about the Rio Tinto legally destroyed Yucatan Gorge in Australia, a 46,000-year-old sacred Aboriginal site. But still, the ESG score did not reflect the problems of the risk. But I would like to talk about the Dakota pipeline, which is very famous and many people know. And this is an example of indigenous people's resistance, widely covered in global media. What is less known in this case is that the pipeline was originally planned to run near Bismarck, a majority white people city in the north of Dakota. But after the people of this city did not accept the project moved then to the indigenous people's territories, and without proper consultation, they established the project in the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation close by, threatening the tribe's only resources for drinking water, which brought a lot of reaction from the community. And next to that, this exposes a double standard. Communities, non-indigenous people's communities were heard, but indigenous people's communities were not even properly consulted. And when they expressed their opposition and their non-consent, they were not heard. And then they came delays, they came protests. 8 billion, one of our member organizations calculated 8 billion loss in all these processes due to the delays, the protests. And I really like the story of an indigenous peoples woman storyteller, Ty Simpson. She went to one of the protests in the Dakota Line pipeline, and she was there one of the mornings very early, and then the elders were talking around the fire, and then one of the women, Dakota old elder woman, was telling her story of upbringing on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, and she was really good. But midday, through one of her stories, there was an elder man who interrupted her and said, "Why are we here? And when will this project be at its end? How long will be here still?" And she took her time in her response. She took a few sips of her coffee and then she glanced slowly at each of the faces watching her with eager interest, and she waited a bit more and she said, "My people are from here. I have no other home. I have no other place to go. I don't belong anywhere else. So I will be here fighting these oil pipelines until they stop drilling or until I die." And that's the feeling you get in the communities, because it's not just a place, a house, it's our life. It's the community, it's the relation with nature, it's our role as stewards. That's why you find the most of the remaining biodiversity in the world next to or in indigenous peoples' territories. So what's the relation of all these ESGs and the discussion in the supply, security, and criticality? This is about risks. As Caroline said, projects without free, prior, and informed consent face delays, protests, lawsuits, and shutdowns, and this is not going to change because just like in the Dakota pipeline, people are tied to the land and the rights are not being protected. These are not rare events. This is common. This is happening everywhere in the world. What we propose is the need to put the J in the ESGs, the J for justice. And that means free, prior, and informed consent is a core requirement. And there are red lines. No consent means no ESG stamp. And there are indicators for FPIC status, land use, land overlap, grievance systems, benefit sharings. Caroline, the Business and Resource Center, have produced a very good report on benefit sharing. But I want to highlight here that benefit sharing is not a proxy for consent. And that is in the last discussions very much used. They say we are going to bring money, we are going to bring capital, we are going to provide jobs. But that does not have to happen until the community has given the consent. What we need to bring the J into the ESGs is to embed indigenous people's rights in the standards, in the GRI, in the IFC, in all the frameworks that we work currently. We have to codify we have to codify indigenous people's rights and the free, prior, and informed consent in the binding legislations. And I want to highlight here a point that was made by Caroline. She talked about the CMSI, the voluntary initiatives. We want to highlight that voluntary standards do not replace or should not replace legal binding frameworks. And we have a strong legal framework, legal non-binding, not exactly binding, but well, morally binding framework, that is the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And when it comes to standards, that is the reference, the basic minimum, to ensure the well-being of indigenous peoples. And also we have to highlight what is happening on the defenders on the ground. In the ESGs, we have to be able to respond how people is harmed on the ground in real, like Caroline said, from the indigenous people's perspectives, the lived experiences. And we have to center indigenous people's participation in ESG standard setting. Otherwise, we risk greenwashing. And the ESGs in the last years have been very much criticized for greenwashing. I want just to close all this by saying that we cannot really talk about criticality or critical minerals without talking about governance, without talking about justice, or without talking about indigenous people's consent. Free, prior, and informed consent is basic. And ESGs can be a tool to do that, but only if they move beyond being checkboxes and embed binding rights protections, human rights protections, indigenous people rights protections, environmental safeguards that are real. And then only then we can build this just and sustainable world. And I remember the question Alesa put us during the IRTC conference in Slovenia. what is our common ground? Our common ground is a sustainable living planet, living all well within the planetary boundaries. And for that to happen, we have to bring the J in the ESGs. Thank you. Saurav, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Yblin, for such an engaging and insightful presentation. I already have some follow-up question on the ESG standard, which I think you alluded to, but I think there are some follow-ups on the comments as well. We see a lot of engagement in the chat, so I highly recommend if you do keep the questions coming, which we will try to compile all of them together and ask towards the end. And I see also the panelists are already responding to some of your questions ASAP. All right, so I think we are towards the last presenter, and quickly sharing a bit about Ludivine. Ludivine is a strategy and governance and policy advisor, specializing in growth transaction, regulatory affairs, government relations, and permitting. She's a managing partner at Latitude 5 and supports natural resource companies and investors and advises government through technical assistance program focused on mining and minerals policy. She has been working on this issue for a long time, has decades of experience, and paraphrasing her own conversations we had last time, a recovering lawyer who has experience in political risk, insurance, and M&A and corporate law, and many things in the same bucket. Ludivine has a oral presentation, which she will kind of compile and share some perspective and thoughts and try to broaden some of the things that we are talking about. Ludivine, if I could invite you to share some of your opening thoughts, remarks, and perspective, that would be great.
Thanks very much, Saurav, and thanks to Caroline and Yblin for the inspiring presentations earlier. I think let's start with some really good news is that we all agree on the goals we're pursuing. So the notion that there can be any form of transition on energy choices, industrial choices, and frankly, the societies that we shape on these foundations without justice and without probably a rethinking of what justice entails is a fallacy. So I think there's a shared understanding here that we are at a moment of profound transition. That being said, there is an element of discomfort to my position here because, yeah, I do work for mining companies and investors, and my job is to either ensure that the governance frameworks that are set in place, whether they're voluntary or legal or supranational, actually guide all the parties towards the outcomes we're, trying to achieve together, or that my clients' interests, in some cases, are understood and balanced and arbitraged with other interests. So I've sat on different sides of this table. So that being said, there were a couple of things that I think were really important here. The first one is that there's how can I say this? You referred to the fact that I've been doing this a while before I had the white hair. And there is an element of this conversation which is eerily familiar. So we pretend, or we actually think in many cases, that some of the conversations we have today are new because there's a new spotlight on minerals, and the criticality narratives, primarily from mineral consuming regions, suddenly have brought a lot of these conversations that were quite distant, often occurred, I'm sorry to be brutal, but in relative indifference from most of the world, have been brought to the spotlight. But the reality is, if you've had your feet on the ground and been doing this for a while, most of these conversations we've either already had, already failed at, already succeeded in sometimes. There are good cases. So I confess, I just want to sometimes contextualize a little bit by reminding everyone that criticality is a policy construct. There is no such thing as a market definition of critical minerals. The very notion of criticality, and I'm just going to give a shout out to IRTC, who are instrumental in getting us to understand that concept. Criticality is born from the realization that minerals are foundations on which all economic activity is based. First of all, for those of us working in the sector, this is not a new concept, but also what that means is that we now have policy shapers who are taking a series of positions, perhaps with less understanding of the fact that whether this is happening in lithium, which is hot and important because it's batteries, or if it's happening in a gold mine, which is frankly the easiest kind of mine you can develop and the most ubiquitous, because at the moment it's easier to fund gold exploration or mining than anything else on the planet. Just to give you an idea, last year, 45% of exploration and development capital in the entire world went to gold mining. Gold is not a critical mineral. So let's not forget that whilst there is a sort of additional layer on criticality, which is a narrative of urgency and a narrative of need, the reality is for the communities on the ground and to a large extent for the regulators who are looking at mining as an element or a pillar of a sustainable development strategy for their country, whether it's a gold mine, a lithium mine, or I don't know, a rare earth reprocessing project, it all pretty much comes down to the same principles. And I know that sounds a little bit like I'm reducing, you know, the importance of this conversation. I'm not. I'm just trying to remind all of us that a lot of this we've dealt with for a while. So there's a lot of the solutions that we've worked on and negotiated a long time. And that brings me to kind of the second point I wanted to raise. I think that while my colleagues, Caroline, Yblin, and I fundamentally strive for the same goal, and maybe I'll phrase mine more with a focus on investment. So my entire job is to bring more responsible investment into more responsible mining projects with the idea that we fundamentally create a paradigm where we can produce these minerals with minimal impact, but also leveraging wider opportunities for sustainable development. So I think in that regard, we do have a bit of a shared vision. I just want to be very careful about sometimes the approach that we all take to this. I recently read a really great article, very interesting, talking about governance capture and how a lot of the consultation processes have been, although they were shaped very much with an idea of creating a consultation space, these processes have perhaps over years of practice really shifted towards being geared to the interests of mining companies and investors. First of all, as a practitioner of those, I'm not sure I share that wildly enthusiastic view. But I do think we just need to remember that if we come into this space with a foundational approach of looking for a negotiation, we create a lot of opportunities. When we, and this is we, every single stakeholder comes into this space with a view of intangible, unmovable lines or goals, I think it creates a lot of difficulties. And I realize Yblin wants to jump on her seat right now, so I'm thanking her for listening. I'm just very aware of unintended consequences. And I think policy is a space where we arbitrage different interests and approaches, and we try and avoid unintended consequences. What I mean by that, for example, is you mentioned the role of voluntary standards. I think no mining investor or operator in the world confuses voluntary standards and law binding regulation. But the fact is, in many, many cases, and contrary to what most people would think, those cases are not necessarily in emerging markets only. But in many cases, voluntary standards will be a conduit for adaptation, for evolution of binding legal regulatory frameworks, which take a lot longer to evolve. So I always see them not just as a good complement, but as an additional space for negotiation. Whilst I'm not necessarily 100% on board with Caroline's firm endorsement of IRMA, I think in general, having very strong voluntary standards and having several of them creates a very strong space for stakeholders to be able to negotiate in different platforms and therefore drive positive evolution. And that ultimately is a key driver of regulatory evolution. The other thing I would say is I get very nervous when we talk about rights or the creation of rights or the recognition of rights, whether we're talking about permitting or the inherent rights of some of the other stakeholders. The difficulty is that if we look at these rights as something that is very negotiated, then by definition, looking for the negotiated solution becomes everybody's job. I'm nervous about the increasing judicialization. That's a hard word for a non-English speaker to say quickly. But basically, the abuse of legal recourse on all sides is something that should greatly concern us. Because whilst we agree that at the moment, climate change and all of the environmental degradation that we are inflicting on the planet is an existential and frankly, the overriding threat of our times, the protection of democratic structures and frameworks is equally important because we will not solve, I think, for planetary issues without having safe, regulated, organized spaces to engage. And so I'm always very nervous when we see the issue of rights being delegated solely to judicial power, because what that ultimately means is that we remove the space for negotiation, because quite frankly, if I know that the only ultimate space where a right is affirmed or denied is a court, then frankly, the business decisions becomes about should we run to court? So I just want to be very careful about how we approach things, because the whole approach of pushing for certain protections can at some point become almost detrimental, because we affect also how the system works in favor of rights protection. And the last thing I would say is the notion of FPIC. There are countries where FPIC has now been brought into the legal order, is a fully binding component of permitting, and is a fully binding component of rights protection. One of them is Canada. And it's very striking that in this context where there is a huge mining track record, there is also a lot of expertise and experience in defining standards for good practice. There are also many cases of violations and things gone wrong. It's interesting that in that space, we've had actually the first decision on what FPIC actually means. And that decision very clearly makes FPIC an obligation for robust process, for robust engagement but not a right to veto. And so, again, I think this is something that we all need to manage, because a right to consent, if it's not a right to veto, becomes a right to a negotiation, so we need to shape what that means together. And if we are not in a straight sort of black or white situation where a judge says yes or no, then that places the onus on all of us to be agents of governance. So I'm just very aware that many mining companies, many mining investors seriously are trying to do this well. How do we leverage that capacity? How do we create more space for responsible investment in mining? And I don't want to again undermine the issue, but since the last super cycle in about 12 years, mining capital has retreated up to 60% in London and at least 40% in Canada. So that means that the countries which were financing hubs for mining and where we have the most scrutiny on investors are actually providing less money into the sector. So I'm very aware that maybe we need to all together look at how we can get more responsible money into the sector, including by taking a more negotiated approach. This is something that I've been working on, including with colleagues who work, for example, on the Sirge project, which is a project funded by Horizon, focusing on how to structure exploration and mining in nature protected areas. I think a lot of these issues are very close. And as Yblin pointed out, Indigenous people's rights run across everything. It's a question of governance, social, environmental, long-term, short-term, mid-term. So yeah, I have often more questions than answers, but what I do think is that a negotiated approach is probably the best way for us to safeguard the future and yet still achieve something valuable in the present.
Thank you, Livin. I think while I was listening, thank you for bringing this perspective in. And I think I just had this two thought. One is we started off this webinar with somewhere close to 31 people, and we still have that many people. It kind of is a metric of such a good engaging session, and I could already see a lot of raised hands and a lot of tension, which I love to moderate. So thank you for bringing that perspective in. I'll bring in Yblin and Caroline as well in a bit in the moderated discussion, but I wanted to point out to the audience as well that some of the references that panelists are making through articles, studies, we will try to cite all of them while we upload this webinar on YouTube and our website. So if you do have follow-up questions on the materials that the panelists are citing, it will all be available. Yeah, so I think let's move to the moderated discussion. I have some questions that I prepared while looking at and studying the work of the three practitioners here with us. Maybe I'll start with Caroline on her work with BHRRC transition. So Caroline, if I can bring you here, I have this very two-parted question. I won't speak for long, but I'll try to give you a little bit of context where the question is coming from. So you highlighted that the 40 legal cases against mining companies in the recent update of the tracker, which is associated with the clean energy supply chain. half of those companies don't have a human rights policy. That's quite shocking. And that makes me think that the voluntary approaches and the certification schemes are failing, which the obvious next step to that would be tougher regulation and stronger due diligence, right? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what are your concerns in this current corporate accountability landscape. We know Macron has done a U-turn in corporate sustainability accounting. So where do you think, what are your concerns on that? And the second thing is, people do like to talk about stronger regulation very often. I'm just curious, what does stronger regulation looks like in your imagination? And I would like to kind of push the panelists in all of this moderated discussion to share some case studies if they can think of, to kind of share a grounded example. So yeah, what does a stronger corporate accountability looks like? What are your concerns with the current accountability space? And you've also asked for very what do you call a reset in global demand. I'm just wondering, what does that reset look like? So I'm throwing a lot of questions on you, Caroline, so please feel free to take a dig at them.
Thanks. Yes, I tried to be short and concise because that's a very big question. But actually, it ties quite well into I think the discussion that Ludivine also started around the role of standards and the role of due diligence and regulation, and how do we see the two playing out with each other. Just to be very specific also about, and to start with this, about our research. So we looked at whether the mines that we track are associated with any human rights policy being in place, be it that is one that the operator of the mine has, or the parent company, or the subsidiary that owns the mine. But we only look at publicly available documents. So when I said that we only found that less than half of the mines are associated with a human rights policy, this means that maybe others do have a policy in place. It's just not publicly available. In our view, to increase corporate accountability, this is the type of document that should be publicly available. So I just want to be very specific on that, and I'm sure there are many companies that have policies, they're just not publicly available, which to us shows, it makes it more difficult to scrutinize the quality of policies, but also for anyone who's affected by the activity of the company to really look at the commitments that the company has made and whether, they are actually just walking the talk on their own human rights commitments. And that's an essential part of building public accountability. So just to be quite clear on that. You mentioned also, so just on the role of standards, in our view, I think you said it actually, Ludivine, and I will agree with you on the standards really help pave the way for legislation in many cases, right? And when I say standards, I'm also referring to non-binding guidelines on responsible business conduct, such as the OECD guidelines, or also the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So they have a fundamental role to play, especially in context where legislation is either insufficient or is not implemented. So this, I fully agree with that approach. But what we've seen also over the years is that it's insufficient to deliver change. So it helps pave the way. It helps also companies getting used to the idea of, what is due diligence and how it needs to be conducted. And this is something we have seen quite a lot in our work. But when it remains voluntary, it also means that in many cases, it will not be sufficient to really protect human rights. And one particular aspect as well that has been really noticeable in the mining industry in particular is a lack of access to sufficient remedies for many communities that have been affected by the long-lasting harms of the mining sector in certain cases. You may have seen a few class action taking place in the last few years. There's a case against Anglo-American related to lead poisoning in Zambia. There was a case settled by a company named Yblin Minerals in Canada a few years ago about that related back to facts that happened in the year 2010 or 2011, and the case just settled after different judicial processes last year. So it's just and this lack of sufficient remedies for people who have suffered harms is one of the reasons why we need to have legislation in place, not only so that so that there is an access to remedy, but also hopefully it can act as a deterrent for the type of harms that then will need remedy. I also share your concern, Ludivine, about the judicialization. It's a difficult word, indeed. We don't encourage it, that's not, just to be very clear, that's not what, when we say we track litigation cases, we are not saying that's the only way to go. That is not our job to say that. We're just looking at what exists out there, and what we are seeing is an increasing number of communities resorting to courts because they have no other choice. And because they are left with harmful impacts, and so they are choosing to litigate to ensure that their rights are respected. But we also see a lot of companies using slabs, and increasingly so, and that's also a big concern. So that's just to say that this is happening. Just to finish on that, and on the CS3D in particular, because you mentioned Macron U-turn and what's happening in Europe. We think that this is a missed opportunity. If the law is abandoned at this point in time for all the reasons that I've just explained, but also because it will just really help well, that's the EU here. The EU looks at mineral supply chains in a way that will actually level the playing field and ensure that their companies, the companies that are active on the EU market, look at transition minerals in a way that really supply chain, in a way that can ensure their long-term sustainability, and therefore will not create disruptions in the supply of this transition mineral. So it's actually it could be an advantage for the continent to have this type of legislation in place as opposed to not having it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for answering that. I think you kind of covered my questions I had. Where do you see this risk materializing? And I think you kind of answered that it kind of hampers if there is no stronger regulations. I have this follow-up on Yblin's presentation, and Yblin, do feel free to incorporate any responses you have to Ludivine's perspective as well. I would love to hear your thoughts as well, but I think I wanted to bring and maybe kind of push you to share a bit about metrics. So what do I mean by that is that you spoke a lot about the FPIC is not optional but essential for any project claiming high ESG standard. You've noted that indigenous people's rights cut across all three ESG dimensions, which we kind of had the consensus through your presentation, which came out really strongly. I wonder what might an indigenous ESG framework look like. If you could share a bit more, if you can flesh that out a bit more, that if there is any specific principles you would like to be incorporated, anything to do with land stewardship or any of that. So I think would love to hear, flesh out a bit more in detail, and if there is any case study you would like to point out. So yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much. Before I go to the metrics, I would like to react to Ludivine as you suggest. It's a very important point there, and I understand that, well, I mean, I don't understand, I didn't really get fully I have the impression I didn't get fully the point Ludivine wanted to make, because she feels nervous about recognizing rights, and actually I feel nervous about not recognizing rights. And I think there is something there that I don't understand. But this is very important point. One point that she brought also, it's about mining and capital. And if you see Ernst & Young, the 10 top risks for the mining sector is social license to operate, ESGs, and this year it's capital, which means investors are getting nervous about what's happening on the ground and what's happening with communities. And I talk regularly with investors, and the investors are really concerned about the increase of mining pushing violations of indigenous people's rights on the ground, and not only indigenous peoples, but my constituency is indigenous peoples, so I talk about indigenous peoples. And I really appreciate Ludivine bringing the question of rights, because from the perspective of indigenous peoples, and frankly, from the standpoint of long-term investment and governance, what is risky is not making human rights mandatory, actually. When rights are treated as negotiable, especially in sectors like mining, which we recognize are high risk, or energy, we create a double standard. Companies can opt in or opt out depending on the convenience or the pressure or the national legislation. And that's not a rights-based system. That's not in line with the SDGs. That's not in line with the Paris Agreement. That's not the way we want to bring this energy transition forward. And that's a reputational risk, enormous reputational risk. That's what I tried to illustrate with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so yes, implementation is very important, and dialogue is absolutely essential, meaningful dialogue, but the floor needs to be binding rights, not voluntary frameworks. It's like when you, I don't know, when voluntary the voluntary standards create a vacuum that often creates unsafe situations for indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples, we see this energy transition as a once in a generation opportunity. And as Ludivine said, mining, it's not new. We know very much the playbook when it comes to mining. We know also that things can get ugly very soon, and we know the solutions, but we know also the risks. That's why mining has the reputation that it has. So if we want to advance really, truly in a just and sustainable way, we have to make things differently. And what was common in the past is that there were voluntary standards, no strong binding frameworks that ensure people's rights, indigenous people's rights, with strong environmental safeguards. That's what should come. That's what should come as the proposal in this new energy transition process. Further on, when we talk about the matrix, the specific matrix and indicators, I don't know, I'm taking too long. Maybe I should stop there, because when we talk about matrix, there are not many, but there are a few that could be applied. For example, the percentage of the project area that is used legally or not. The measurements on the legislation that regulates water sources and water use in a determined country. For example, now in Argentina, you see people, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, Peru. Now it's not the lithium triangle, it's the lithium pentagon. All these countries are involved. And when you see, they are opposing mining projects basically because it's risking or it's endangering the water access of the communities. And water is linked to water drinking, water is linked to agricultural production, water links everything, water is life. And what you see on the ground is that the legislation, for example, in Argentina, is being changed, reducing the rights of indigenous peoples on the ground. So we are not seeing an increase of rights, but a decrease in rights. I will stop there, Saurav.
Awesome. Thank you, Yblin, for sharing your thoughts. Before I move to Ludivine, on the last question I have for her on value chains, there was this question that before I move to the last bit to ask Ludivine about the value chains, I wanted to insert the question that was asked in the chat, which I thought would be good to ask here. Is any of the panelists have any thoughts, maybe Caroline or Yblin, on the question was, indigenous community usually have a different worldview that Western legal frameworks don't encompass. How can we better transform ESG now to better fit indigenous worldviews? Is there any thoughts on that? So the indigenous community usually have a different worldview that the legal Western legal frameworks don't encompass. Is there a way to broaden that? Is there anything that the Western legal frameworks don't understand better because there is a worldview, different worldview?
I can take that one. Well,
Yes.
part of that one. Yes, there is a different worldview, but the basics is the same. Life is life. And maybe what we should highlight is that when indigenous peoples see territories, they see water, they see life, and they don't see money. And money is part of, or is, we could define we could bring the strong approach to sustainability, where money is in service of the community, and the community is in service and embedded in the broader natural world, not where the natural world is exploited on the endangering the natural systems like we are doing. If you see the Amazon rainforest, we are about to endanger the Amazon forest via mining, via extensive intensive agriculture, and pushing this biogenic carbon capture in the name of economy or in the name of climate change. And then at the core is the well-being of the people. So in the indigenous people's perspective and cosmovisions, we are part of nature. We are part of our very expression of Earth is La Pachamama, our Mother Earth. And we are there to take care of nature, not to exploit it. How can we bring this together? We bring it to through respect of the rights. Not all communities are opposed to mining projects or renewable projects. The veto that Ludivine also mentioned, the veto is confused with FPIC. FPIC is not veto. FPIC is the right to say yes with conditionalities, or no to how the natural the natural world and the resources are going to be developed in certain area. And bringing cosmovisions of the indigenous peoples and the Western world together is bringing basically the understanding of what should happen. Should we respect land rights? Should we respect water rights? And how should we respect indigenous people's rights? Are we going to protect land defenders?
Thank you, Yblin. I think these are really good thoughts. I think just to share my thoughts on this particular interesting question about what does legal framework miss. I think studying in the discipline of deep ecology, I think there is a common notion among eco-modernist or people within the Western, I mean, not Western world, but in that thinking is that we could modular or we could change ecology in the service of us. And there is usually a pushback within a certain discipline of thinking that that is not the case, that you cannot put giant vacuums on the atmosphere and suck out all the carbon, that we cannot modernize ecology in such a way that we can sustain such energy intensive economy. And some traditions likes to push on some of those assumptions, or you could call them wise traditions. So moving on to Ludivine, I think this is a very interesting question to close this conversation towards, and I hope I was able to kind of answer and take all the questions either on the chat or through directly asking them. Is to kind of bring Ludivine on the last bits of value chain. While digging up the work, I think Ludivine has always questioned whether today's new partnerships and policies are really reorganizing value chains to create, quote unquote, to create and distribute value more fairly. And I wonder, Ludivine, if you have any thoughts or if you could flesh out what changes are needed to ensure that this time around, historically, I guess we are kind of alluding to our colonial past, is how this time around local communities and economies truly benefit from new mining practices, or is it new in any way? So how can we promote more value addition and investments that doesn't leave some of these communities behind?
Okay, so I have a 4-hour, 22-part response. Okay, no, all joking aside, I don't want to come across as a nostalgist. What I do think is that the last time around, and I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old. I'm just talking about the last super cycle. So basically 2000 to about 2012, the China growth-driven mining boom globally. I think there's two things that are key here, and one of them my co-panelists alluded to. The first one is mining has a terrible legacy. So we need to acknowledge that unlike many businesses, we have been around for a long time. We've gotten this very, very wrong. And when we do, it's there, like it stays for a long time. And this legacy is, yes, I spent 10 years in West and Central Africa. Yeah, it's right there to see, but it's also here in France in my backyard where coal mining ended 60 years ago, and you have legacies from 200 years ago. So the legacy issue is one that I would love to say, okay, let's just take a blank slate and start again. But that's not possible. That's not the way the world is. So I think, first of all, there are an increasing number of people in this business who acknowledge that we have a terrible legacy, but also that we have a responsibility not to create the next legacy, because that is also a risk right now. And so as much as I'm very concerned about the new projects and building the consensus that should be, exactly as Yblin was saying, the underlying foundation we build on, I'm also equally worried about the projects that are being put on care and maintenance, and then people disappear and regulators are left completely helpless. So I'm worried about the beginning, the middle, and the end of things. As you can see, I'm a happy, constructive jumper. That being said, I think having acknowledged the legacy, let's look at what we're dealing with here today. And I want to agree that there's an opportunity, but I think that opportunity is less in whatever boom everybody thinks is coming. First of all, some people don't believe there is a mining boom coming. Martin Lynch, I'll put a note in the chat and then share the links. But Martin Lynch is one analyst who said, not only we're not going into a mining boom, we probably have 30 years of low demand environment, including with new demand for transition minerals. So let's just always keep in mind that when we make projections about mining demand, we've been right as much as we've been wrong collectively. And that leads me to the second point. What's the opportunity here? The opportunity is we have tools that were developed in the last mining boom, but then by the time we got around to really deploying them on a large scale, to really agreeing bigger frameworks to implement them, well, the entire industry scaled back. And amongst those tools, there are, yes, voluntary standards, again, not as the be all and end all, but as a space for us to engage. It's very, very valuable for us to have a space to talk. And frankly, that is 50% of the value of these standards, is that they convene us. Aside from these tools, we also have things like community development agreements. Community development agreements have failed, have stalled, have been forgotten, but they've also succeeded. And for me, they remain one of the outcomes of the last mining supercycle. By the way, they were theorized by the World Bank. There's literally like entire libraries about how to make them work. And they are a guide to negotiating the new paradigm of investment. Maybe the road here is to say, okay, we stop thinking of permitting as the state granting one right and having to balance it with other rights. Maybe we all show up to a conversation and we negotiate how the right to exploit a resource is allocated and how it balances with other rights. Maybe we do this in a much more holistic way, where we don't just look for a nice box to tick, because that's the trick with FPIC, is FPIC starts on day minus 20 years, and it continues every single day of your operation. All of this is a constant dialogue. So maybe let's just accept that. Maybe let's go for completely contractualizing permitting. I am, of course, speaking myself out of a job here, but that's the opportunity. Let's maybe put things on the table that we weren't quite bold enough in the last super cycle, and leverage that experience, because we've had that experience. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll let everybody wrap up, is that I think there's also an internal change in mining to consider. This is an industry that is having literally right now a complete crisis of identity. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for us, but just look at it as an opportunity as well. There are huge demographic impacts, which mean that you have entire generations of management that are simply not there. This means that we also have an opportunity to engage constructively, to rethink ourselves, rethink our investment models, rethink our entire regulatory ecosystem. That's incredibly uncomfortable. It's incredibly difficult. And it's also one of the reasons that mining is deemed high risk. And contrary to folklore, it's not necessarily high reward. Just to give you an indication, the level of profitability of mining grossly worldwide is usually estimated, depending on who you talk to, between 5 and 10% return on investment. A US government bond, the steadiest, most boring financial instrument in the world, is 5% today. So we have the highest risk in the world, and we can barely do better worldwide. Gross estimate, probably wrong, but it's the best we've got. We can barely do better than the lowest risk investment. So I think collectively, we need to rethink, why do we need this sector? How do we hold ourselves accountable as investors, as professionals, as participants, also as buyers of minerals in product? And how do we hold our policy shapers, accountable to doing much better in balancing these global, national, local stakes? I think none of this is going to be easy. The best chance we stand is having these extremely uncomfortable conversations.
Thank you, Ludivine. This is brilliant. I mean, I feel like people would expect a follow-up blog post written by you about the lessons from Supercycle that happened in the last decade, and there's a writing piece from you expected. We are almost towards the end of our webinar. I would like to just share some housekeeping notes, but before that, I want to massively thank Ludivine, Yblin, and Caroline for sharing their work, taking their time from their busy schedule, and share with the audience that have signed up, which are part of IRTC, friends of IRTC, and the larger community outside. I think I learned a lot from this. I hope not only the panelists learned from each other, but the people who participated in this. Just to share a quick closing note, this conversation is recorded, and I will try my best to compile all the citations material which are shared on this chat, and to kind of compile them in a much easable, readable format, and attach it with the video recording, which will be posted on IRTC and YouTube channel. The question is, how will you know? Is we encourage you to follow the pages which are on LinkedIn and YouTube, and there are many more webinars coming, organized by the board members, the junior board members, and we are constantly striving to convene the leading voices in the field, be it from the academic, research, or practitioner perspective, as you could see from today's session. So thank you all once again for joining us and sharing your questions, your thoughts, your insight. And we really look forward seeing you next time. And thank you, and hope to see you in the next one. Have a lovely afternoon, evening, night, wherever you are based.
And thank you to you for the excellent moderation.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Saurav. Thank you,
Thank
Caroline.
you, Saurav.
Alessa.
Thanks, Ludivine. Thanks, Yblin. See you.